all it's doing by ruminating and dwelling on that thing that's outside of your control is just adding to your suffering. Because if there's nothing you can do about it, what's the point in letting it consume you and overwhelm you? What's the point in letting it consume your headspace if there's genuinely nothing that you can do to help the situation? All you're doing is bringing that thing that's upsetting you to the forefront of your mind and almost highlighting the fact that, oh, there's actually nothing I can do about it, but I'm going to continue to think about it. So who is this helping or benefiting by dwelling on this thing? Nobody. Are you feeling a little bit overwhelmed with all the external pressures and expectations that the new year brings? Maybe you're feeling a little bit stuck in your current situation or feeling anxiety about falling behind. The good news is you are not alone. So many others, myself included, are feeling the exact same way. The further good news is therapy can help. A therapist can help you distinguish external pressures from your own internal values. Develop a timeline that feels authentic to you rather than one imposed by society. Process any feelings of inadequacy or comparison and whatever else you might be feeling or experiencing. Whatever challenges this new year might bring up for you, BetterHelp, who is sponsoring today's episode, can help make it easier. BetterHelp is a therapy platform that is entirely online, making it both comfortable and convenient. Simply fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And don't worry, you can easily switch therapists at any time if it's not the right fit. Start fresh at any day of the year with BetterHelp by clicking the link in the show notes or go to betterhelp.com/unfulfilled to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Unfulfilled. I am your host, Camille. If you're new here, thank you so much for showing up today, to tune into the show, to show up for yourself, to live a more fulfilling life. Today, we're going to talk about worrying about things that are really unimportant. How many of you find yourself totally consumed by things that ultimately really don't matter in the grand scheme? How many of you find yourself wasting so much energy and headspace focusing on all of these things, these small things that really don't matter, that you look back on and you're like, why was I so worried about that? But we ruminate on them anyways. We know they're small and unimportant, but often not in retrospect. So today we're going to talk about catching ourselves in those moments of when we find ourselves so consumed in the unimportant and how to shift away from that, how to free our headspace to focus on things that actually matter. But before diving into today's topic, fun fact, more than half of you who are listening to the show are not following or subscribed. So if you are not, please press follow or subscribe wherever you are listening on Apple or Spotify. All this will do is give you access to episodes every single week when they come out. Really appreciate you guys showing up today for yourselves and for being a part of this community. So glad you're here. If you're new, thank you for tuning in. So back to today's episode. I ultimately realize how much energy and headspace I waste on stupid things, on things that actually I've paused to recognize are not very important. And that's why I wanted to do today's episode, because in the grand scheme of things, why are we wasting so much headspace on things that don't matter or things that are outside of our control? Our headspace and our thoughts are precious. And so the sooner we can catch ourselves in these thought patterns and these habits of dwelling on the unimportant, the sooner we can return to thoughts that serve us and return to things that are actually important. And again, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. I think a lot of us spend a lot of our energy and headspace ruminating and dwelling on things that in the grand scheme really don't matter very much, or that matter for like 2 seconds, but we spend way longer actually consumed by it. So in this episode, we're going to cover questions we can ask ourselves to determine whether the thoughts that we're having are important or not, whether it's worth dwelling on this thing and allowing it to take up our headspace in this moment. Easy questions that'll help us identify when we're either habitually lost in thought or just falling down this unnecessary and unimportant rabbit hole, or if this is actually worth our headspace in this moment. So before we dive into the how and these questions, let's talk about why we worry so much. Why do we constantly fall down these patterns of ruminating on things that really don't matter? Our thoughts come from so many different places, right? External influences, stress, projecting our past. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that our thoughts are habitual. Most of our thoughts are just habits. They're thought cycles that we've been trained to continue to fall down for our entire lives. So for years now, we've been training ourselves and strengthening this habit of having these worrisome thoughts, of dwelling on things that really don't matter. It's habitually ingrained in us. So of course, we're going to continue to do so. And that's why we're constantly worrying and constantly finding ourselves in these thought patterns, in these spirals. And if we don't start to question this habit, this narrative that we constantly fall down that's allowing us to consume our headspace in these things, we're just going to think that's normal or necessary and continue down that path. So that's why today's questions are so important, because we're going to start to question our thinking patterns. And in doing so, we're going to free up our headspace. Because again, I know a lot of my headspace gets consumed by things that ultimately don't matter. So I've started asking myself these questions, and it's been really helpful in allowing myself to release these thoughts on the sooner side. Because the sooner we release them, the better. The sooner we release them, the sooner we create space for things that do serve us, for thoughts that are important, that do matter, that are worth our headspace. So let's dive into them now. These are the 5 questions we can ask ourselves when we find ourselves caught up worrying about unimportant things, or just worrying at all, falling down these stressful thought patterns. First question, am I present? The best way to tell if we're drifting towards habitual thinking, if we're falling down these habits, we're falling down these thought spirals and getting consumed and overwhelmed by them, is simply asking, am I present in this moment? Or have I fully gone elsewhere in the past or future, fully clinging to my thoughts, and it's taken me entirely out of this present moment? Often when we get consumed by our thoughts, especially worrisome ones, we're entirely out of the present moment. It's almost like we've transported to a place that doesn't even exist because we get so consumed by our thoughts. But the second we come back to the present, when we do eventually come back and check back in with ourselves, we can identify that, oh, actually, we just got really consumed and lost in our thoughts for a second there. But then we come back to the present moment. So this first question is key to identifying when we get lost in our thoughts, when we allow these worrisome thoughts to consume us. Because do you notice that most of the time when you do come back to that present moment, when you finally fall out of the spiral of your thoughts, you come back to checking in with yourself, you realize that there's actually nothing to worry about in this moment. Often it's just us getting so consumed in our thoughts, we almost like create a problem out of thin air. We create these worries simply from our thoughts, and then we realize when we're actually present, when we come back to the presence, that, oh, actually there's nothing wrong in this moment right now. I was just so consumed in my thoughts that it took me out of this moment. But in this moment, everything is actually okay. It's just our worrisome habitual thinking that's making us feel like something's not okay. And again, often the thought isn't even important. Often these worries are just small little things that don't matter in the grand scheme and are not worth our headspace, and very much not worth taking us out of the present moment for. So that's number 1, simply asking, are you present? And that's more to, again, identify when we've gotten lost in these worrisome thoughts. So that's really helpful. And that is part of the yoga instructor in me saying, like, always return to the breath, always return to the present moment. But this mindfulness trick is just so powerful. So once we've returned to the present moment, the next question we want to ask is this in your control? Let's be honest with ourselves here. How much of what we worry about is entirely outside of our control? It's something that we really have no impact over, but we choose to dwell on anyways. We choose to let it consume us anyways. But by asking this simple question, is this in your control? If the answer is no, that's your immediate sign to let this go. It's very easy to want to continue to dwell on that thing until it's fixed or resolved or perfect, right? If it doesn't fit your expectations, of course, we're going to want to focus on it and ruminate on it and feel upset about it. But all it's doing by ruminating and dwelling on that thing that's outside of your control is just adding to your suffering. Because if there's nothing you can do about it, what's the point in letting it consume you and overwhelm you? What's the point in letting it consume your headspace if there's genuinely nothing that you can do to help the situation? All you're doing is bringing that thing that's upsetting you to the forefront of your mind and almost highlighting the fact that, oh, there's actually nothing I can do about it, but I'm going to continue to think about it just to cause myself some suffering here. So who is this helping or benefiting by dwelling on this thing? Nobody. It puts it into that unimportant and unworthy of your headspace category because there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do to change that. So as hard as it may feel, it's truly in your best interest and everyone's best interest to not ruminate and dwell on this thing that's outside of your control. And the sooner you let it go, the easier it will be to release that worry, that stress. But the more you dwell on it, the more difficult it's going to be to let it go. So time is important here. The sooner you release, the better. Because again, if this thing is outside of your control, there's no one you're helping by ruminating on this thing. All you're doing is hurting yourself at the end of the day. And then third question, kind of tied to number 2, but follow-up question here. If this is something that's within your control, if that answer to the question was yes, is there anything you can do about it right now? If there's nothing you can do about it right now, then don't let it consume you right now. Don't let it take you out of the present moment if there's nothing you can do about that thing right now to make that situation better in this moment right now. If you can do something to change it in the future, fine, let it consume your headspace in the future. But if you can't right now, don't extend the problem by letting it consume you in this moment. If it's a next week problem, let it be a next week problem. If it's going to have more importance next week, fine, let it consume your headspace then. But if you can't change it right now, that's your sign to let it go right now. Let it come back into your headspace when it's actually going to benefit you too. Come back to the present moment now and know that there's nothing you can do about it now, and that's okay. And so give yourself permission to release it right now because there's nothing you can control in that situation right now. So question number 4, this one's really impactful in tangibly asking, how important is this thing that I'm letting consume me? Will this matter in the future? Will it matter next week? Will it matter next month? Will it matter next year? Will it matter in 5 years? Will it matter in the next hour? Use the 5x5 rule. So this rule that if it won't matter in 5 years, don't waste more than 5 minutes on it. So I love this idea because it's such a quick, easy way to put things in perspective for us, to immediately allow us to recognize, oh, wow, it just seems really important because I'm letting it consume my head right now, but I'm not even going to think about that next week, especially next year. Things feel a lot more important when we're allowing it to take over our whole headspace. They feel all consuming the more energy and focus that we put on it. The more we cling to those thoughts, the more important they feel. But by coming back to this timeline and asking ourselves, will this really matter in the future? It gives us permission to let go and recognize, oh, if this isn't going to matter in the future, near or far future, again, whatever timeline feels suitable for you, know that it's okay to let it go. Give it 30 seconds to a minute, but know that if it's not going to matter in the far future, don't let it consume a lot of your headspace in this moment. By simply zooming out and asking, will this matter in the future? It immediately can give us clarity that, oh, actually, this is not worth dwelling on. So if you do find it hard to let things go, this rule is more of a tangible one that really allows you to actually stick to it and say, okay, this does not fall in the important next year category, so therefore I have to let it go. Or reminding yourself of this 5x5 rule. Important in 5 years, not going to spend more than 5 minutes on it if not. It's a great way to zoom out and gain perspective, right? Because I would argue that 99% of what we dwell on, at least what I worry about on a day-to-day basis, barely matters next week, let alone in 5 years. And so this is a great reminder to just let go of those things that are not going to matter to our future selves. Because again, by dwelling on them, it's really often not serving anyone. It's only hurting ourselves by giving our headspace, our precious headspace, to these unimportant things. And when I do find myself worrying about the future, worrying about things that might matter in the future, but really I can't do anything about them right now, I remind myself to come back to trust. I say, okay, I trust that everything's supposed to work out as it's meant to, and letting this consume me and filling my head with these worrisome thoughts in this moment isn't going to change that. It's not going to help that situation. So that's just another plug that I wanted to throw out there. And finally, 5th question, does this matter to me or is this important to someone else? Am I internalizing someone else's worry in this moment? Am I internalizing someone else's values, what they find important, and tricking myself to think that it's important to me? And this one's kind of a sneaky one. I think a lot of us find ourselves stressing about what other people are focusing on. So for example, we hear them focusing on that thing or worrying about that thing, and suddenly we're like, oh, should I be worried about that? Like, should I be doing more of that? We internalize what other people are worrying about and stressing about. And so whatever you are worrying about or stressing about, whatever thought patterns, are they your values? Is it something that's important to you, if it's important at all? So for example, okay, let's say your good friend is on this money savings plan. They're really getting their finances in order. Didn't even cross your mind before. You're pretty financially good. It's not something you tend to stress about. But the second you hear that they're doing it, you're like, oh, maybe I got to get my finances in order. And then suddenly you spend the next hour worrying about your future finances. You're spiraling and thinking that you're not saving enough. Oh no, I went on that trip last month. I really probably spent more than I should, all because you heard that that person was focused on it, that they were giving it importance. And so it's easy to internalize that and make it your own worry and your own problem. But when we ask ourselves, do I really prioritize this? Is this really worth my headspace? Is this something that's going to benefit and serve me based on my principles and values? We can recognize that maybe we are just internalizing the stress of others. Again, we're trained to absorb things from our surroundings. It's where a lot of our thought patterns come from. But when we start to question that, when we start to ask, do I actually find that important? Is that actually serving me to dwell on that? We can start to distinguish those external things, those things that we internalize versus what we actually find to be important, what is serving us in our own lives. So ask, do I really care about that or value that? Is this relevant and important to me in my life? Or is this something I picked up along the way? Is it something I internalized that I can let go of. I can free up my headspace for something that is important to me. So those are the 5 questions. Let's recap. Number 1, are you present? Whenever you find yourself falling down those worrisome thoughts, those stressful thought patterns, return to the present. Identify when you've fallen into those thoughts, when you've strayed from the present, and when you return to the present. Then we can start to ask, okay, number 2, is this thing within my control? Is this thing that I'm worrying about even something I have an impact over? Number 3, is there anything I can do about it right now if it is within my control? If not, give yourself permission to release that. Number 4, will this matter in the future? If it's not important 5 years from now, don't waste more than 5 minutes on it, or whatever timeline. Maybe you want to go by a week, something sooner. Is this going to be important next week? If not, let's let it go. And number 5, is this important to me, or is this a stress or worrisome thought that I've internalized from someone else? If it's someone else's value and not yours, you can let that go. You can free up your headspace for things that do matter to you, that are important to you, that are in alignment with your values. So those are 5 helpful questions to identify and return back for when you've fallen into those worrisome thoughts, when you're dwelling on things that really don't matter in the grand scheme. I have found these helpful in my everyday life. Hope you guys have as well. If you did, please leave a rating or review on the show. Send this to a friend who might enjoy the episode. I love you all. Thank you for showing up for yourselves and continuing to be a part of this community and help grow it for us all to live more fulfilling lives. See you all soon.